Our first session is going to be about why is OSHA updating its Silica standard. And we've got two presenters for that this morning. The first of those is Scott Schneider, here to my right. He's the Director of Occupational Safety and Health for the Laborers Health and Safety Fund of North America. I think most of you probably know Scott. If you haven't, you probably want to know him after the presentation this morning is done. The fund is a nonprofit association that's affiliated with the Laborers International Union of North America. He's been with the fund for 13 years. He's got a master's degree in industrial hygiene from the University of Pittsburgh, so he's local. And he's got a master's degree in zoology from the University of Michigan. He's been certified industrial hygienist since 1989. He is a 2009 winner of the William Steiger Award by the ACGIH for his contributions to the profession. So he's been in this area a long time, done a lot of good things for it. So we're looking forward to hearing Scott's remarks on Silica standards. So Scott?
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, great. Okay, I wanted to start off by just sort of giving a little historical perspective. Silica, the problem of silica in the workplace is not a new problem. If any of you read back in 1700, Bernardino Ramazzini published the first book that sort of explained which diseases are related to which occupations, and recognized respiratory diseases among stonecutters, which was very likely to be silicosis. And then 200 years later, in 1910, Alice Hamilton, who was really the founder of occupational health in the United States, did a study of granite workers in Vermont and found huge amounts of silicosis disease among them. And then in 1938, Congress was outraged when over 400 workers died of acute silicosis at the Gauley Bridge tunnel job in West Virginia. And I'm going to show you a brief video about that. In 1938, Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor, appointed by Franklin Roosevelt, and she commissioned a national study of silicosis in America, and they came out with their results.
After a year of work, the National Silicosis Conference Committee has just made its report of findings and recommendations, and I feel it to be my duty to make this report available to the working people of the United States and to their employers by every available method. This report shows how silicosis occurs, where it occurs, and what the disease is, and it makes recommendations for its practical control. Above all, the report emphasizes that these control measures, if conscientiously adopted and applied, that silicosis can be prevented.
So Frances Perkins, 73 years ago, committed us to stamping out silicosis, to getting rid of it as a disease. And after this national conference, and then in it took several decades. It wasn't until 1970 that OSHA was created. And then in 74, NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, recommended that exposures to silica be dramatically lowered to 50 micrograms per cubic meter, and they recommended a comprehensive standard be set. That OSHA didn't do it at the time, but waited another 25 years almost, or 23 years, until Robert Reich was Secretary of Labor, and they began a second campaign from the Labor Department to deal with silicosis. And they had this campaign called "It's Not Just Dust," and they had another national conference to eliminate silicosis. And then 9 years later, the ACGH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, recommended that an even lower exposure limit for silica, based on the fact that it not only causes silicosis but also lung cancer. So they recommended the exposure level be lowered down to 25 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, OSHA's efforts date back to 1974 as well. Back in '74, when NIOSH put out their criteria document saying exposures to silica should be reduced, OSHA published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking and asking the public whether or not they should adopt the NIOSH recommended limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. In 1989, when OSHA tried to update 400 some permissible exposure limits, they also recommended that the exposure limit for silica be modernized, and the method to measure it to be converted to milligrams per cubic meter. But that PEL update was thrown out by the courts. So in 1997, 14 years ago, OSHA finally put silica as a standard on its regulatory agenda, saying they were going to, over the long term, put out a silica standard. In 1999, they said that OSHA expects to propose the standard by June of 2000. They labeled the measurement method for measuring silica obsolete. And then in 2003, they did a small business panel review of the proposal. In 2010, they completed a peer review by scientists of the health effects data. And then they said that they expect to publish the proposal this month in June of 2011. So you can see OSHA's been thinking about this, working on it for quite a long time. What are the health effects of silica? There are approximately, according to the data that we have, about 150 cases of silicosis in the U.S. per year. And that's dropped tremendously over the years. But there is evidence that many cases of silicosis go unreported. For example, there was a study that was done of construction workers in New Jersey who had died of lung disease, but it didn't say silicosis. And they went back and looked at all their x-rays after they died and found that 8.5% of them had silicosis that was unreported on their death certificate. And then there was a study in Michigan where they looked at silicosis in the state of Michigan and did national estimates of how many cases of silicosis we are to expect every year. And they estimated between 3,600 and 7,300 new cases of silicosis each year in the United States. And then, as I mentioned earlier, about 30 years ago, it was recognized that silica does also cause cancer. It was recognized in 1997 by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, designated as a human carcinogen. And lung cancer cases probably outnumber silicosis cases. I'm sure they do. Silica also causes other forms of respiratory disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, etc. And the problem is the awareness of this hazard is very low because construction tends to be dusty and these effects are chronic, so someone may not know about it. They're not going for a regular exam to get their lungs x-rayed. People that are doing these exams, if they get them, are not trained to recognize silicosis. So it may go undetected for many, many years. In which case, and there maybe years after they've had many, many years of exposure on many different job sites, and then eventually they end up with silicosis or lung cancer. So I'm going to show you a short video from the WorkSafe in British Columbia that sort of explains some of the health effects.
Silica. It's one of the most common substances on Earth. It can be found in materials like sand and rock, and building products like concrete and brick. When a worker cuts, grinds, or drills materials that contain silica, dangerous crystalline silica dust is released into the air. As the worker breathes, silica crystals flow into his mouth and nose and down the air passages deep into the lungs. The tiny crystals enter the small, fragile air sacs where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells, called macrophages, engulf and try to dissolve the crystals, but they are unable to. Over time, more and more crystals build up inside the macrophage cells. The macrophages carry the silica into the walls of the lung, where they die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more cells die. This damage can continue even after the exposure to silica stops. Eventually, so much scar tissue forms that the lungs can no longer function. For information on how to protect yourself from silica exposure, visit WorksafeBC.com.
Okay, so we've talked about the health effects and about the history of regulation or lack of regulation. I want to go on and talk a little about exposures in construction. We know from the studies that have been done that exposures in construction operations can be very high, particularly from operations like tuck pointing and abrasive blasting. But exposures can be controlled easily and inexpensively, primarily using water or local exhaust. There have been many studies published over the last 10 years in particular showing that water and local exhaust can reduce exposures by generally about 90 to 98%. And more tools are coming on the market every year equipped with controls. Some states, like New Jersey and California, have already banned the use of dry cutting, and they have not experienced any compliance problems. I'll show you, for example, here's a fact sheet from the state of New Jersey about their new law that bans the dry cutting of concrete. OSHA published a new publication in 2009 on controlling silica exposures in construction, where it goes through different operations like handheld masonry saws and talks about the best ways to control it. And NIOSH has published a number of workplace solutions on using water to spray to control dust during breaking concrete with a jackhammer, when grinding concrete, for enclosed operator cabs, rock drilling, and many others, and they're all available on the web. And much of these solutions and data have come out just in the last 10 years. And they also have a page where they have engineering controls with videos showing exactly how the controls work and how well they work. And here they're showing dust suppression for cutting a block. Other countries have done tremendous work on this too in the last 10 years. In 2002, the ARBOW, which is a Dutch labor management group that does research on construction safety and health issues, put out a book on control of dust in the finishing stages of construction, which talks about using different criteria for purchasing equipment with controls. And many companies like Hilti have gotten in on it and put out materials about their equipment that already comes equipped with controls and how it not only increases safety and reduces exposures, but also can increase comfort and productivity. Now, the OSHA proposal, we don't have the proposal, it hasn't been published yet, but 8 years ago they published a draft proposal which was sent to the Small Business Administration, and basically it offered 3 different choices of permissible exposure limits. It modernized the measurement method from millions of particles per cubic foot to milligrams per cubic meter. It had a table in it, which we pushed for in the labor side, that called Table 1, which specifically has, here are the tasks that you're doing, and if you're doing this task, these are the controls that must be used. This was specifically designed to help small businesses, so that small businesses don't have to go out and do a lot of air monitoring and figuring out, well, are we below or above today or tomorrow, and then send the samples off to get analyzed. In a couple days, the sample comes back. They say, okay, look, if you're doing this operation, these are the controls you have to use. You don't have to do a lot of expensive air monitoring. And here's an example. This is what Table 1 looked like. You could see if you're using a stationary masonry saw, you have to use wet methods or local exhaust. et cetera. And then it showed for each of the different PELs, 50, 75, or 100, whether you would need a respirator or not, in addition to the controls. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to say that silica has long been a health problem in construction. It often goes unrecognized because of the long, chronic nature of the illnesses. People are not getting exams, and the physicians are not trained to recognize it. The government has been trying to regulate it for almost 30 years now. The controls are available, they're easy to use, they're inexpensive, and they're effective. And it's finally time to get to work and protect workers from this serious hazard. Thank you very much.
We have our second speaker, Rob Collius, who is president of the Refractories Institute, a trade association headquartered in Pittsburgh. Provides a range of services to the refractories manufacturers, suppliers, contractors, and installers of refractory products. He was born and raised in Connecticut, holds a Bachelor of Art degree in Political Science from Rutgers. He did serve 3 years active duty in the U.S. Army Security Agency. Prior to joining the refractories, he was vice president of the Washington Affairs for the Portland Cement Association. He began his professional career in working for OSHA, so has quite a bit of experience in this area as well. So looking forward to hearing Rob's presentation as well. So.